Hello, listeners, and welcome to the 200th episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Hard to believe it's 200 episodes as Cognitive Dissidence. It's actually more when you factor in the Perch Pod days of the podcast. Many of you probably don't even know that this podcast originally began as the Perch Pod, and we had I forget how many episodes there too, but this is the 200th of Cognitive Dissidence, and we celebrate by Rob and I rejoining together, and we give you 70 minutes of conversation. We spend the first 11 minutes talking about some of those previous episodes and some of our best calls. If you don't want to listen to that part, just skip to the 11-minute mark where we start talking about investing in Brazil. There's a really, really important conversation in there about utilities in the United States and the relationship between utilities and energy and innovation that I think is important. And at the end, we get to the US-China news. So it's a long podcast, but I think it's worth it. And I got a lot of thank yous from listeners who are saying, hey, I'm listening to you on the commute, or I'm listening to you on the tractor, or things like that. I don't like these 20-minute podcasts. So keep telling me that, because everybody else tells me it needs to be shorter, but I don't think you can say anything in a short amount of time. I'd rather give you sort of the longer part of it. So that's what we're going to continue to do until the numbers tell me otherwise. Listeners, if you want to talk about anything you heard in this podcast, and we talk a little bit about investing in particular here in a way that we don't normally, because we usually keep it on the content. But if anything we said in here triggers something in your brain, you want to talk about, financial advisory services or planning or geopolitical or anything like that, email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. You can also email me if you're bored, or if you have a potential guest that you want me to bring on, or a book that you think I should read. Anything else, I am here and at your service. Otherwise, take care of the people you love. Cheers, and I will see you out there. Rob, it's our 200th episode, which probably means you've appeared on like 100 of these. I didn't actually go back and do the counting, but how does it feel? Do you feel like an old grizzled podcast veteran, or do you feel as green and naive as when you started?
Oh, well, I'm sure you remember, but the first time we tried to record a podcast, I literally, we had to just keep stopping the recording because I could not talk. I would start talking and then I'd just be like, oh, forget that. That was terrible. So I'm no radio host, but at least I'm better. I'm functional. That's saying something. It only took 2 years.
You've gotten much better. And also, I mean, I used to edit the podcast myself, I had a lot of English as a second language folks on the podcast and things like that. And like you were a walk in the park compared to having to go in and delete all the ums and this, that's, and the other things from those types of guests. So I think you were always too hard on yourself. That was the whole problem. You were too hard on yourself even as you were talking. You were like talking and thinking, no, I sound like an idiot. And then you would stop talking and this whole thing would go there. So welcome to Hot Take Land. Now you just say what you think and it's all good.
Yep. The idiocy just goes off into the ether and you never hear about it again. So it works.
Yeah. Well, we thought before it's a really busy week in geopolitics and in markets. We have a lot to talk about. You and I didn't get together last week, but I thought we should just talk about sort of the podcast a little bit and get a little self-referential. I had our producer go back and I had him pull some of our most listened to episodes, and then I picked out some of our episodes that I thought were the best, where we were the most prescient. I was surprised at the episodes that were the most listened to of all time. So the first was on October 12th. It was not the reaction to the Hamas attack on Israel and Israel's retaliation, but it was our interview with Kamran Bokhari, who's one of my favorite guys and guests to have on, talking about sort of the Israel-Palestine war in general, Iran's role, things like that. I think that captured the fear of Iran in World War III, and that's why people were listening. Helen Thompson's appearance on November 6th about her book, Hard Times in the 21st Century, has the number 2 slot right now. That makes sense to me. She's absolutely brilliant, and her book is absolutely brilliant. But I was sort of heartened to see that like one of the best performing episodes was from British academic that maybe people hadn't heard of that much. And then, of course, number 3 is one of Cousin Marco's most bombastic appearances in October about settling scores and about the U.S. elections and things like that. So those are the top performing episodes. But some of our, I think, most prescient takes, and there's a few, but there were 3 that really stuck out to me. And it's nice. It was actually fun for me to look at the dates and to see what we said and to see how well some things held up. So on Halloween 2022 was when we came out and said, in a very contrarian way, We think all the concern about European energy markets is nonsense. We think that Europe is not going to freeze over. We don't think that natural gas prices are going to the moon. If anything, we think they've already peaked. We do think there are problems in certain parts of Central and Eastern Europe, that Germany's supply chain may for a long time suffer from higher costs and things like that. It wasn't sort of just a one direction take, but we were very, very sober at that time. And that was a very, very contrarian thing to do. It wasn't just like the Economist cover that said Europe was going to freeze over hadn't even come out yet. Like, if you're doing the opposite of the Economist, you're on track. But we were 2 months ahead of the Economist, freaking out. So I was happy about that. The second one that I thought was really good, and you might remember this, Rob, was do you remember Spy Balloon Gate? Listeners, do you remember Spy Balloon Gate, when the United States and every single media publication was like just focused on the sky and looking at the stupid Chinese spy balloon, and oh my God, this is World War III because they're going to send the hot air balloons and they're going to kill us all. And I did a spicy sort of, this is nonsense. By the way, I don't think things are that bad with US China relations. I think Biden is trying to improve things. And I think we've actually seen some movement in that direction. So I said that in February 2023, as everybody else was freaking out about the spy balloons. That was exactly right. You had the Pelosi visit to Taiwan, which threw a wrench into things for a while. But in general, Biden had made the decision that he didn't want to escalate with China. He wanted to keep things where they were and actually try and build a more pragmatic relationship. I use that word a lot, but just wanted to be in dialogue with them, wanted to compete where they needed to compete, but also cooperate and coordinate where they could. And that's happened over the last 12 plus months. I'm not sure that that continues indefinitely, but I think it was really important at that point in the media cycle to come out and say, okay, spy balloons, like, please, like, go play with your kids or develop a hobby, like turn off CNN and stop what the Wolf Blitzer doing 24/7. Where's the spy balloon in the United States? My God. I'm getting mad just thinking about that time. And then last but not least, and in some ways maybe the best, June 23rd, 2023. I knew that we had, we've talked in recent months about how we were talking about inflation was going to be higher for longer and things like that. We came out and put our cred on that on June 23rd, 2023, where we said we didn't think the Fed was going to be able to cut rates. We thought that inflation might stick around for longer, that it might be higher. And I don't know of anybody else in June 2023 who was saying those things. And that's probably one of the reasons some of our strategies, especially on the income side, have done so well, because we teed that up right and got it correct. So if there have been some other things in there, as you told me, Rob, before I started talking, like, I've talked about my incorrect call on Russia invading Ukraine ad nauseum, so I won't repeat it here. We've been wrong about some things like the direction of the Japanese yen, or really the level of intervention when the Bank of Japan intervenes. We've been long wheat for a long time and have gotten stopped out multiple times. So like we have, I'm not saying that everything is 100%, but I think that's three pretty big things to click. Like Europe's not going to freeze over. U.S.-China relations are going to get better. Inflation is going to stick around. We had 6 to 12 months of lead time for all of those in those episodes. So it was cool to look back at that. Like I know that we're doing good work here because it feels good when we stop recording the podcast, but it was a fun exercise to go back and look at.
And a good exercise to look and say, well, what can you take away from this, from a listener standpoint? Because some of our listeners are investors and they're actually, practicing in markets. Some of them, the majority of them are just, following what's going on in the world. So rather than just sort of pat ourselves in the back, like, I think there are some useful lessons to be gleaned from 2 years of talking about stuff publicly and being on the record and getting certain things right and wrong. The first takeaway, I think, is, we haven't been deeply wrong about anything, I think, that I recall, or at least, certainly not in our portfolios as is expressed. And I think the reason for that is because we have stop losses. Stop losses both in the literal sense, but also in the narrative sense. Like whenever we're out there saying, hey, we think this is going to happen, we have, sort of pre-identified, well, if this, and this happens, then we're wrong. And that's very rare and it's very annoying to have to do. But if you're in the business of having to anticipate things, it's essential because you're never going to get everything right. The best, traders in the world, Jim Simons, who just died, Renaissance Technologies was right like 54% of the time. And they were the most successful hedge fund in the history of the world by a long shot. So 46% of the time they were wrong. And how do they control the risk when they were? I think that goes for narratives as well. But more broadly, I think if you look at the things that we've gotten right, I think it boils down to two sort of patterns. The first pattern is just kind of fading extreme sentiment. I think that's something that we do pretty well. So the balloon gate in a more geopolitical context, like, yeah, this is just way blown out of proportion. Um, but also, if you look at Brazil, if you look at some of the things we've said about China and sort of picking bottoms in things, Europe is a perfect example. Natural gas. Hey, here's this extreme view, and it feels so tangible. It feels so real because it's all over the news, and this event is happening, and everyone's talking about it, and it's the snowball effect. Just to be able to step back and be a good Bayesian, if you want to describe it that way, and say, okay, this is we're going to fade that because it's not that extreme. And I think if you want to recreate that, it's simply about creating that space where you can have the context to step back and sort of view it with some distance and just look at the underlying facts of a situation. Um, the other thing that I think that we are good at that sort of is reflected in some of the good calls. So take the inflation call, for example. Like, that's been from a profit and loss standpoint, from a doing good for our clients standpoint, that's been by far the biggest thing that we've done in the last 12 months.
Yeah.
Like, that's been the biggest success and has so many ramifications across all these different markets, which is why it had such an impact, right? Um, I don't think I told you this, but every week I meet up with Miles and Tomas, who have been on the pod before, and we have a check in and we talk about sort of, I ask them about technology stuff and stuff I'm reading about, and they share what they're learning and thinking about because they're on our innovation advisory board. And a few weeks ago, they were asking me about the inflation. They said, "Oh, wow, you guys really got that right." They said, "How did you see that?" And I said, well, Miles, we looked at like how the economy works, and we looked at what is the state of it today, and then we looked at, well, what sort of things could change, and how would that impact the system going forward in the next 6 months. And Miles said, but that's just like basic systems analysis, because Miles is an engineer, he's not an investor. He said, isn't everyone doing that? I said, Miles, I said, I think you overestimate who you're up against in the investment world. And that sounds conceited, but the notion of um, just being able to envision, how do I say, like there's a wonderful video of Richard Feynman, which you may have seen. It's on YouTube somewhere. It's a super low quality old one. And he's in front of a group of students and he's teaching. It's like a summer session or something. And he says, what I do is imagination in a tight straitjacket. Imagination meaning that you have to imagine, things that could be true, in his case in science, but he said they have to be consistent with the laws of the universe, right? You can't just make shit up. It has to be in a tight straitjacket. And that's what it's all about, right? Like even Bruce Kovner said the same exact thing in a different format in the original Market Wizards when they said, well, Bruce, how are you such a successful macro trader? And he said, I can imagine configurations of the world that are different than today and really believe that they can happen. Like, that sounds so banal and stupid, and people who don't do this may think like, well, why are we wasting our time with this? That's obvious, but that's not what 98% of people do. 98% of people are running around like chickens with their heads cut off, worrying about what's in the news or overly emphasizing, what's in the news rather than just kind of quietly analyzing things.
Well, it's funny you say that because there's two things that comes to mind. First of all, I love the idea of the narrative stop loss, where it's not just a stop loss on the trade, but it's like, no, like we said this on the podcast last week or last month. If we're wrong, like I have to come and say it on the podcast. I can't pretend like I didn't say this thing a month ago. And it does. It enforces the discipline. It makes you accountable in a way that you wouldn't be otherwise. And another reason, like I started the podcast for myself. Like I was talking to lots of researchers and academics and things like that, and I wanted to record the conversation so I knew what I talked about in the course of them. And I was like, hey, why don't I just like record them and publish them? It'll be good for them because they'll get more out there, and I'll have a log of sort of things that I've talked to them about. So from that, it's sort of just a good research thing. But I love the idea of a narrative stop loss. But on that point, I'm not sure it's not that it's chickens with their heads cut off. So I'm slowly plowing through this book project. I'm making my way through chapter one, and of course it's taking longer than I thought. But I reread Choices, Values, and Frames from Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky last week. And there's a lot in there, but I've focused in on this study that they did where they basically found that people get way more upset about losing $50 than they would be happy about gaining $50. So if you lost $50, if your financial advisor lost $50 in the market, like the average human being would be furious at them. Whereas if that advisor gained you $50 because of some good trade that they made, you'd be like, okay, that's great. Like it would be asymmetrical. You're more upset about the loss than you are about the gain. And I was thinking about what that might mean for the financial industry in general, because I think what that might mean is that you've got an entire industry that it's almost like basketball players playing scared in a game seven. It's like you're so afraid not to lose money that, to your point, you're not thinking about how the world could be different. You're not chasing opportunities. And there's a fine line there. If you're chasing opportunities too much and you're risking all of your clients' capital and you lose it all, like you're not a particularly good steward of capital. But if you're just sitting there in bonds because you can tell the client, hey, bonds are safe and bonds like don't go down as much as the rest of the market, so let's do annuities and things like that, like you can see that there's this reflexive fear of the client because the client is going to get mad at you if you lose money rather than happy with you when you gain money. And it's an interesting thing because if you want to do best for the client and grow the wealth, you have to have a client who's willing to see that and who is willing to be as happy when you make the money, or happier when you make the money than when you lose the money. So I think there's some social conditioning in there that force financial professionals to do that. And one of the reasons the inflation thing is so interesting is because last year, I mean, bonds took it on the chin with equities. Like the thing that was supposed to be the safe asset did not perform as the safe asset. And I think that's one of the reasons there was probably is so much distrust right now with financial advisors because they did the conservative strategy. And in this world where things are changing so fast, like it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work like it did for the last 30 years. So I don't know. Maybe you'll want to push back on that, but it's not a fully formed take yet, but I'm leaning towards that take more and more.
Well, I wouldn't push back on it, but I would add to it by saying, you know, this is funny, people's psychological biases and the way financial advisors react to them, because the conventional wisdom, for those who don't know in the audience who are not in the financial industry, the conventional wisdom is it's okay to lose your client's money as long as everyone else is losing money at the same time. And I'm not being sarcastic. That's truly how the business model works. So, like a 2008 scenario, that's fine. No financial advisor is sitting around hemming and hawing over, oh, I made a mistake because, it was just a perfect storm. No one could have seen that coming, and everyone else lost money. The way financial advisors stay up at 2 in the morning is when the market is going up and their clients are not participating. That is what gets you fired, because it's not fear of loss per se that causes a client to fire you. It's social exclusion when all the assholes on your street are bragging about how much money they made, you know, in Nvidia or whatever the thing of the month is. And that's why financial advisors have a huge incentive and have created this whole intellectual superstructure around just be passive, just own the market. Ironically, that's very good for them because they never have to deal with either of these risks. You know, one would think the job of a financial advisor is to not lose your client's money and hopefully make them good money. That's not the job. That's not how they set it up. They set it up so that you don't underperform too much in up markets at the cost of getting clobbered whenever the market, you know, takes a dive, even for extended periods. And that is a set of incentives and behavior that I think most, like, obviously I disagree with it because I'm making fun of it, and and we're to some extent tasting the negative side of that, because in our asset allocation strategy we've been underweight U.S. equities for an extended period now, at least 6 months, and our clients have underperformed on that side. Thankfully, we made it up on the bond side to a great extent, but that's a true choice, and that's not how most financial advisors work, for weird and twisted reasons.
Yeah. Which is why no matter who is your financial advisor, you should trust them and you should get out of the rat race. Like if you really want to get above, like, I mean, it could be us. It's self-serving for me to say, hey, call us. We'll take care of you. But like in general, when I speak to audiences in general and I'm talking about these things, I'm like, make sure you have somebody you trust. Make sure you have somebody who you're talking to. Make sure that you yourself are checking yourself, that you don't flip out based on reaction to one thing. Like one of the reasons you have an advisor is sort of the same reason you have a therapist. It's a sober-minded person who can disconnect themselves from the emotional attachment to your savings, your hard-earned savings and things like that, and say, hey, like, I know it feels like everything is going great, or I know it feels like the world is ending. Like, here's what we're seeing. Here's maybe the things you should be doing to be responsible. So no matter who it is, whether it's us or somebody else, like make sure you have that person that you trust in your corner. Anything else you want to say about investing or the podcast before we move on to what's going on in the world, Rob? Let's plow in. Okay, it's a crazy week. I thought we would start, and we don't have to spend a lot of time here because I know I did the solo cast on Brazil last week, but I know you love Brazil. Also, the situation has not gotten any better. If anything, it's going to get worse. So the airport is going to be closed in Porto Alegre indefinitely. There's more rain coming. There's been such bad rain that one meteorological monitoring company called Metzel in Brazil said that earthquakes in one of these states in the southern regions were caused by the amount of rain that was coming. So we're getting literal earthquakes caused because there is so much rain and it's affecting the ground so much. Like that completely blew my mind. It's just a really, really sort of sad, depressing situation, and it's not going to improve anytime soon. You can go back and listen to last week's podcast about some of the implications and property insurance and these other things. I also just wanted to juxtapose it. It feels weird to do this, but we have to. It was an interesting week in sort of Brazilian markets because finally the other shoe dropped on Petrobras, which is Brazil's big energy company, and which over and over again seems to become the center of gravity of conflicts within the Brazilian government in general. Like the Brazilian government, when it goes left, it always wants to go to Petrobras, and when it's a rightist government, they always want to unleash Petrobras. It's like it really is. I'm forgetting the term that I'm looking for, but it's that center of gravity. And we finally got the announcement of the exit of their CEO and their CFO. And it looks like a former regulator who is close to President Lula is going to be appointed interim, or maybe is just going to take over as the head of the state-run oil firm. That makes about 4 Petrobras CEOs in just as many years for political reasons. You might remember Bolsonaro was pressuring and cajoling and firing Petrobras CEOs because even though he wanted to unleash Petrobras from its shackles, he also wanted low energy prices going into the election. So he was pushing sort of back and forth. Petrobras shares dropped over 6%. I'm sure they're going to drop more. There was already controversy earlier this year where Petrobras was supposed to pay a big special dividend, and they didn't because it seems like Lula put some pressure on there. And this new former regulator has talked about in the past about not paying out dividends as much, but instead investing in things like exploration, new infrastructure, all those other sorts of things, which means less returns to shareholders. It might actually mean good things for Petrobras. Maybe it wouldn't. I sort of get skeptical when it's the state that is dictating those things and not the market. But you can also see, if you're looking at Brazilian ETFs or the Brazilian market in general, like it really weighed down. You've got this sort of twin problem of the flooding and looks like Brazilian interference in the Brazilian market that is pushing back against some of the narrative on Brazil. So, Rob, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about, are you concerned about the Lula government at all? Do you have anything you want to say about the flooding? Is there something else that we should be talking about that people are missing? Because, also inflation seems to be coming down a little bit in Brazil. There's other stories here too. They aren't the only ones, but I thought the juxtaposition of those two things was an interesting place to start the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, on Petrobras to start there, um, I'm not really drastically changing my analysis of anything as a result of this. I mean, Petrobras is a very unique company. I think if this sort of behavior began to be extended beyond Petrobras, then that would be something to really be concerned about. People forget Petrobras is not just an oil exploration company, it has a massive downstream business too. So they're running and selling gasoline, which is a huge political football. I think the United States would probably behave in the same way if they had the same influence over gas prices. So I don't really think it tells us much about the Lula government and they're doing something drastically different or drastically different from what a lot of other governments in the same position would do. And this ties into, I know we're planning to talk about electricity generation and distribution later. This is a very similar issue where when the government can, get its fingers into something, it's very rare that it won't, especially when that thing is so tied into, consumers' pocketbooks. So no big deal, I think, is my take on the I'm sorry, on the Petrobras issue. On the flooding issue, I mean, I thought you did a really good job in the podcast sort of summarizing some of the key points. This really does hit very close to home. I don't think I told you this, but some of my very closest friends in the world are from Porto Alegre, and they, sent videos of their uncle rowing in a boat above their, like, they lost everything, and they have to raise Kickstarters. I think part of this, okay, that's my little human connection, but to put this back into sort of wealth and economics and markets terms, our friends had to raise a Kickstarter because they lost everything, and people do not have the wealth cushions to recover from that easily. This is one of the vulnerabilities of the emerging world, and Brazil, relatively speaking, is richer than a lot of places, especially in Porto Alegre. It's one of the richest cities in Brazil. So this sort of thing is bad, both for sort of immediate and obvious reasons, but also because it drains the wealth that is sitting around and that Brazil needs. Remember, a lot of sort of our bull case on Brazil that I've been hammering on about over the last 2 years is this notion of capital scarcity becoming less of an issue, capital friction and friction of capital markets becoming lower, and real interest rates becoming lower, and unleashing some of these entrepreneurial activities in the country. If you're sucking up wealth because of natural disasters or other just mismanagement, that pushes against that. So that's something to really be aware of. Not everyone in Porto Alegre has friends in, Massachusetts to ask for money to help bail them out, and they're screwed, you know? So I think that's a really important point to keep in mind. There. Um, Otherwise, I think this is an interesting test to see how the Brazilian government responds to this disaster, and this is truly a disaster. Um, Rafinha scored a goal last night for Barcelona and ripped off a shirt, in support of Porto Alegre. So this is something that Brazilians all over the world are really focused on, even though no one in the news seems to care very much. So, how the government responds, how they deal with sort of allocating resources, because Lula's already talking about, how do we put in place the structures to protect against this sort of thing in the future and to cushion the blows of similar issues. Watching that will be a key indicator, but you know, so far everything aside from sort of the obvious negatives, I think Brazil is still showing signs of going from strength to strength absent this.
Well, that's at least the silver lining. I don't think we should wait to get into the the utilities conversation. So why don't we pair it there? Because I'm afraid that if we go down the U.S. China rabbit hole, we will stay there for the rest of the podcast. And I think I've said often, like Brazil and the U.S. sort of have these weird similarities. I think so. It's a good place to sort of pick up from there. And I'll set the scene a little bit, but then I'll let you make the tie-in and go from there. Utilities are doing great in the United States. They're at a fifth, or the utilities index is at a 52-week high, up 8.5% since the beginning of April. That makes it basically the top performing S&P 500 sector of the second quarter, if you can believe that. I love that. I'm reading something off of Market Watch right now, and they're saying that the reason is that they are the latest to enjoy the artificial intelligence bump, because all the power needs that there's going to be there for artificial intelligence means that suddenly people are turned on to utilities. Apparently, if something does well, it's all because of artificial intelligence. And you pointed out the Wall Street Journal has also been covering this deeply in the last week or two, talking about the need for power in the United States, how different utilities are maybe going to be at the forefront of this, and why they're becoming a more interesting sort of investment vehicle and things like that. And I know you have a take on that, and I know that you want to take it in a different direction. So I'll just lay it up to you right there. Why are you skeptical of the run in utilities right now, and what do you think it means? And also, like, compare it back into Brazil, because I thought that tie-in was important. I don't want to lose that thread.
Yeah, so at the markets level, one of the things to think about is so the U.S. market is now testing and making a new high. But if you look at what's leading the market, as you point out, utilities are the best performing sector in Q2. Um, and everyone's telling this story about AI and, this is a tech story. It's not a tech story. It's a defensive rotation story, because the other leading group are consumer staples companies. So if you looked at the Dow 30 index, for example, and you looked on Monday, which is when I went through all these charts, the only company in the Dow 30 that was making a new high last week was Procter and Gamble. So is this your rip roaring bull market? It's not what you want to see if markets are really, off on a sustained bull run. So anyway, so part of the utility thing is just rotation into these defensive names, which is usually, a pretty defensive or risk off kind of sign. The connection with Brazil is illustrative, because I think this is what people miss about utilities. There are a lot of examples of countries in emerging markets fucking around with their utilities, because it's so tempting and easy. Like, I'd encourage you to look at Argentina and Edenor, which is the electric utility there. They have, I mean, it's gotten a little bit better recently, but for the last 25 years, that has been the kind of the football of the political class in Argentina. And basically, they've used this utility as a sop to consumers, because when inflation is high, the utility is there. So utilities, because they're regulated monopolies, both in the emerging markets and in the US and Europe, they are political footballs. And politicians can't keep their grubby hands off of utilities. And I think that this is going to be the same thing in the United States. In Europe, for example, they just pushed through a pretty comprehensive and really significant change in the way that electric utilities are regulated in Europe, as a result of what they call the sort of extraordinary profits of the post Russia-Ukraine invasion period, which we don't have to get into the mechanics of what happens. But basically, utilities made a lot of money because of a weird distortion in the way that the pricing mechanism is set. And then very quickly, like, you think, oh, governments in Europe, especially, they're always dithering over everything. They never get anything done. It took them like 6 months to come in and just squeeze these utilities and change that. So, at the sort of fundamental or theoretical level, utilities are not where you want to be in a period where governments are feeling pressured and not magnanimous and far thinking, which is the environment that we're in now, because they are under the thumb. Utilities are allowed to earn something. They're not free to earn whatever they want. Let's remember that, right? So like that's the high level stuff. Let's talk about AI and what's happening there, right? Because I think a lot of people are excited about electric generation and oh, AI is so power hungry. Um, I think this is problematic for a few reasons. The first is what I just said about controlled returns on a lot of these assets and uh, government regulators not being in favor of allowing these utilities to lay out massive amounts of capital and earn a good return on that capital, which is what you're betting on if you own utilities. So that's the first one. The second one is the response to the AI demand is likely to hurt a lot of utilities in ways that people don't anticipate. So look, I don't know if a lot of people were following this, but there was a proposal in the last few years in Massachusetts in New England, really, across multiple states, to take renewable energy being generated in Quebec and to build a long distance transmission line to bring that energy from Quebec into New England, where it was badly needed and where they had all of these, renewable energy targets that they were looking to hit. And it was a no brainer, right? Obvious solution. They had excess energy. New England had excess demand. It's renewable, blah, blah, blah. And it got defeated, right? In part because of NIMBY issues. But then when the government sort of uh, appealed, I don't know the exact process, but there was an appeal and it came into the courts. And who came and fought against it in the courts? It was the electric utility because they didn't want competition coming in for their own generation assets that they were producing locally. And this is the rub for a lot of these generators is once the genie is out of the bottle and we finally realize, hey, we have to do significant investment in these electric grids, then you're talking about sort of inevitably there are going to be measures to pave the way and break down these local generation monopolies because it doesn't make sense to generate everything locally when you have sort of imbalances between regions, and not only between regions, but between different parts of the day. So people have talked a lot about this notion of, hey, Europe can have a lot of renewable generation, solar generation in North Africa, and pump that into the European continent because they have a lot of sun. Like the same economic reasoning applies to the United States, and arguably in a lot easier way because we have, I mean, slightly more integrated electric grids. Not I mean, in many ways, it is like freaking Morocco versus France, the way that the Texas grid is segregated from the other grids, but we don't get into that. But anyway, without going on and on, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is there are a lot of cozy generation monopolies at a local or regional level that are under threat if the scenario that people are betting on actually happens and you get significant electricity demand from workloads growing in data centers, which is happening, like I don't dispute that, but if it does, the solution is not, oh, we're going to buy these little cozy monopolies and they're just going to make bank. Like, no, it's very unlikely to work that way. So if that's what you're betting on, then I think that's a poor risk reward. So how do to turn it into a positive instead of, I'm always cynical and complaining about things and saying why they're stupid. To turn it into the positive, how do you play this? I think the way you play it is by playing the picks and shovels companies, literally. And we wrote our analysis of the generation and grid theme for our clients on the knowledge platform in some detail. And without going into too much detail, there are companies that are selling into the grid build out, equipment companies, and these are fairly stable oligopolies. And there are some really interesting opportunities within those companies to buy companies that 15 years from now are going to be triple the size. in addition to companies that are E&C companies that sort of install, but then they maintenance and maintain the grid. And their business, they sign these long-term multi-year contracts to do that. And as the grid gets bigger and more complicated, those contracts are just going to get bigger and bigger. It's like an annuity. So those are much better risk reward areas, at least that we're pursuing on this theme. And anyone who's listening and gives us any credence, I would caution you against going out and buying some electric utility because of something you read in the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, and there's two things I want to add. I think you'll agree with the first. I wonder what you'll say about the second. The first is that, like, I think you can see that the monopolies are not going to work because the tech companies, the ones that are actually the gatekeepers for AI, they're talking about vertically integrating from a power perspective. There's a reason Microsoft is investing in small modular reactors. There's a reason that Meta and all these other companies are thinking about getting off the grid because they don't trust the grid and they don't want to be subject to the grid. And they have so much money on hand that if you can control your costs in your own way and you can drive it down better than the utilities are going to give it to you for, great, go at it. So you could see the utilities like losing access to some of these customers or the kind of disruption that goes into that. Like, that's one of the things that's there. The second, and we've talked about this a little bit and put it on the knowledge platform, but this notion that if you replace aluminum conductor steel reinforced cables with some of these new advanced conductors, there are studies out there that say you can quadruple electricity transmission capacity in the United States by 2035 just by replacing the types of cables that you use. And you can maybe make them lighter and you can have less connectors and things like that. Like, the whole thing can be optimized in an incredible way. And I don't know, it goes back to the picks and shovels that you're talking about, because it's not necessarily the utility that's going to do well. If the United States government decides that it wants these hyper efficient cables to be put in, they're going to pay, and the companies that make these cables are going to do pretty well. The thing that I wanted to ask you about, because we haven't talked about it, is it reminds me of our conversation, what was that, months ago now, about tires. Remember, I was somewhere in the Midwest and it was a town that had been big on tires. And I found that there was this weird point where the United States had been ahead on tires and then it got behind on tire construction. I forget exactly what the thing was, but Europe basically, companies like Michelin had advanced tire production. The United States was doing it the way that it had before because of inertia, because that's the way the system was. And this thing that that all these studies in the United States seems to have discovered about these new cables, like the Europeans are already doing it. Like Belgium, the Netherlands, some of these other European countries, they've been replacing these cables and outlaying like the money to replace these cables for years already now. And I was wondering if there's a metaphor to be made there between sort of U.S. tire companies, which never really recovered, and how actually there are other places in the world that are ahead here, and it might be companies in Europe that are going to be the ones that sell the special cable that everybody's going to want in order to increase the efficiency of their grids. Or I don't know, maybe Biden's going to come in and do tariffs on those too. We'll get to that in just sort of a minute. But is that an example of the type and pick and shovel you're talking about, or is that more problematic? And how does that work, sort of U.S. versus international or European or other markets?
It is an example of pick and shovel. The leading companies who do this, actually, I think what you're thinking about are they look like balls, and they put them on the wires. The leading company that does that is from Scandinavia, not a U.S. company. It's the dynamic, it basically measures the temperature of the wire, which is so silly how simple it is, but it increases the capacity dramatically. It's called dynamic capacity. I forget the acronym, but you get the idea. So yeah, it definitely is. As far as regional differences, it all comes down to how the incentives are structured, because this is what makes utilities so tricky, is they are inherently, highly regulated industries. And so you really have to understand, how does the regulation work and what sort of incentives does it create in each of these different geographies that you're analyzing. So in the US, just the example I just gave, the utility, you know, was actively saying, we do not want this thing that's obviously good because it's not in our interest. And that's them acting rational. Um, I mean, the structure of utility regulation in the U.S., for the most part, with some exceptions like independent generators and stuff, but most regulated utilities, you get paid for how much shit you have. That's called your rate base. And I literally mean, how much physical shit do you have? How many wires, how many telephone poles, how many generators, how many transformers, what is your capital base? What is the amount that you're allowed to earn a return on? And that's how they calculate how much you can charge. So, one of the big barriers to doing these sort of common sense efficiency improvements is that they don't get paid for that. It doesn't increase your rate base. It just means you can sell you sort of less you can sell, how do I say, you need less stuff to sell the same amount of electricity, which is not what they want. They want more stuff.
Yeah.
So that's a major issue, and that's creates inefficiencies, but it's sort of inescapable because they are natural monopolies and they need to be regulated. So there's no simple answer there, but yeah, it varies drastically based on geography.
Well, I think you're also really highlighting, like, there are some areas where the US government and businesses are in lockstep. Like, it's good for the US government if the tech companies make a bunch of money in general. Like, let's throw that out there. But there are industries, like we're talking about here, where actually the US government and governments in general are on the opposite ends of the companies. So, like, the US government wants cheaper energy for people. It's not interested in the utilities making tons of money and paying out dividend. It wants people to have actual cheaper energy. I talk about this with farmers all the time. Uh, the US consumer wants cheaper food and the US government wants cheaper food, but that's not what the farmer necessarily wants, because the cheaper the food goes down, the less that they're going to make, and then the farmers start to go out of business. Maybe we're going to get there with data. I don't think we're there yet. I think it's too nascent, but maybe we're going to get to the point where controlling data, or the amount of data that can go through on your phone or on your computer, your internet and things like that. Maybe we're going to get to the point where the US government is going to be like, no, we want data to be cheaper. And the telecoms companies are going to be like, no, like we want it to be more, and sort of go back and forth. But to your point, like as these things break down, like there are these, or mining is another great example. We should have Tomas on to talk about that, where everybody wants secure mineral supply for all these essential mineral commodities and things like that, but you want them cheaply. The reason China dominates is not because China has all these minerals themselves. They don't. They have to import most and then refine them at terrible cost to their own environment. It's that they do it so cheaply, and they don't care about the damage they do to their environment, that your iPhone only costs a couple $100. So you have this thing where the mining companies want to make money because they think there's scarcity, but the governments are like, no, like we want our own supply, but we don't want you to gouge with prices, because we need all of these components and parts and electronics and things like that. We need them to be cheap. So we need the cost to go down. So I'm sure there's opportunity in here, but I think it is a really clear, it's not just utilities is what I'm saying. There's a really clear battleground between some of these things that governments want one thing and business wants another. And in a world where you get national security messed into it, and the fear of the boogeyman and the fear of China, like you put all that in, it's a pretty unnerving cocktail.
Yeah, one additional thought on this is, I think that's right, and I think the equilibrium between what the government wants and what, in this case, utilities want, is going to move to a place that's good for everybody. And I think this sort of compute electricity demand growth is the savior, because just to put some context here, what the government wants is cheap energy and resilient grids. It doesn't want to be in a situation where a hacker can come in and take down, all of the Texas electric grid because they took down one critical choke point.
Mm-hmm.
And if you remember, I think it was in 2012, some unknown people shot a transformer with a rifle in California and managed to take down like a significant portion of the electric grid in some segment of California. Do you remember this? So
I
this
don't.
was sort of all over the place in utility industry circles, and people expected copycat issues, and it never happened. And
Well, I'll just say the reason I wasn't on top of that at the time was I was just a young Middle East analyst at Stratfor. 2012 was when I was doing my magnum opus project on the Tunisian soybean crushing supply chain. So in 2012, I was the foremost expert, I think, of Tunisia's soybean supply chain in the United States. Anyway,
what
sorry,
is
go
going
on.
on in Tunisia soybeans? Well, no, we can. We can.
Oh, right. Like, I mean, I was the expert in 2012. I have no clue. I know what I said in 2012 and what I thought was going to happen, but I haven't checked it. But we can do a whole episode on the Tunisian soybean supply chain if you want. I was in there on Google Earth, like, oh, here's the crushing facility. Here's the anyway. So I was not focusing on things like power and the more important.
Anyway, it was scared the shit out of a lot of people, in short, and it really drew a lot of attention to the vulnerability of the electric grid, both to cyber attack and just physical attack. Like some guy with a rifle managed to do that, and no one ever figured out who it was, as far as I understand. So, so the government wants resilient grids and wants cheap energy. Uh, Part of the problem was they the utilities don't want people to get solar. They don't want them to go off the grid. The government wants people to get solar and go off the grid because they want the energy to be cheap, and solar is a general purpose technology for which the cost is collapsing year after year after year, which is great. Um, so the issue until recently was utilities didn't like that. They didn't want that because if people go off the grid, you get death spirals. So if you look at Hawaii, for instance, they were the canary in the coal mine for this years ago because Hawaii has notoriously high electric prices because they're a little island in the middle of nowhere, and previously they had to bring in their energy on ships for the most part. I mean, it's not a well designed system, and it's also very sunny, and people were getting rooftop solar and getting off the grid. So the more people who get off the grid, the more the utility has to charge everyone else to make up because they have to pay for all the stuff that they're able to earn the return on. So you ended up having these sort of death spirals starting to emerge. And the reason why I say that I think the AI is a savior is because if you look, um, what's happening is they're providing enough demand boost where people can get off the grid, and the utility is going to still be able to sell all of the electric generation it can produce anyway. So they're stable. Homeowners can, create these virtual power plants by pooling rooftop solar and decentralized solar. We get a more, sort of resilient and decentralized grid. Like it's all very good. It just doesn't mean that utilities are going to make much money. They're not going to have death spirals and die, which is good. And they won't, be in such a position to want to mess with homeowners who want to get off the grid, which is good. And governments are happy. So that's the silver lining to a lot of this. It's not necessarily a great profit opportunity for any of these players, but it's good for the macro situation, and it's good for the picks and shovels sellers.
We got to hit U.S. China a little bit, and it's actually a good segue because we'll talk about the fireworks in U.S. China this week. But beneath the surface, there was a pretty mundane meeting between China and the United States. Their first meeting about artificial intelligence and how they were going to cooperate with each other or not cooperate with each other. And I'm forgetting who said this on X. Excuse me, I apologize. I'm forgetting who said this on X, but it was the right point. And I'm going to make it here, which is that the United States and China, they had a productive meeting about artificial intelligence, it sounds like, in Geneva. It was called constructive on the Chinese side. But the United States seems to be treating the AI issue as it's a problem between the United States and China and not thinking about it as a global issue. Whereas China really is pushing for like the United Nations should think about it. There should be global governance. And I think as long as countries are thinking about AI in these sort of national silos, it becomes subject to state competition. It probably puts a ceiling on where things can go. We'll see where it goes. It was just a very initial conversation between the two sides about that. But that did happen this week, and that is a trope to sort of watch as it develops over time. But the fireworks in U.S.-China relations this week, and we'll just do a couple minutes on this before we go. But the Biden White House announced some pretty significant tariffs on Chinese goods. And I'll just give I'll give the listeners a quick rundown of what was in these tariffs. Tariff rate on semiconductors will increase from 25% to 50% by 2025. Tariff rate on electric vehicles will increase from 25% to 100% in 2024. On lithium ion EV batteries, that's going to go from 7.5% to 25%. Lithium ion non EV battery, same thing, 7.5% to 25%, except that one kicks in 2026. So a 2-year reprieve there. Battery parts, 7.5% to 25%. Natural graphite and permanent magnets, that's going to go from 0 to 25% in 2026. Other critical minerals are also going to go from 0 to 25%. The tariff rate on solar cells, whether or not assembled into modules, is going to go from 25% to 50% this year. And then these were the most interesting to me. Ship to shore cranes are going to go from 0% to 25% in 2024. Syringes and needles will go from 0% to 50%. And then other personal protective equipment like respirators, face masks, that's going from 0 to somewhere between 7.5% and 25%. And that includes rubber medical and surgical gloves, which are going to go up to 25% in 2026. So it's a big basket of things. China's mad. China says they're going to retaliate. I have to think that China knew this was coming. I don't know what all the meetings back and forth with Yellen and Sullivan and Biden talking to Xi was, if they weren't warning China, hey, like, we're heading into the election, we're going to do some things to try and buttress Biden's populist credentials or anything else. We'll see what China retaliates with. So I don't think that this is some new trade war. I got to think that it was telegraphed, but still, there's a lot of interesting opportunities just in that basket that maybe we can talk about. But the last thing I just want to throw in here is I'm not sure what the Biden White House thinks it's doing. I don't think this is going to improve his prospects necessarily versus Trump. I will say, if you look, Pew did its annual sort of survey of Americans holding what Americans' views on China are. And it's sky high unfavorable against China. 81% of US adults see China unfavorably. 43% have a very unfavorable opinion. This is one of the ways where top level government actually affects the way things are. You only get a really sharp spike in anti-China views in the United States around 2016, 2017, when the trade war kicks off in earnest. If you go back to 2009, 2010, more Americans actually have favorable views of China than not. So, for instance, in 2009, it was 49 favorable versus 38 unfavorable. So there's been a huge shift there. And I don't think that's a grassroots thing. I think the US government has said China's a boogeyman, and the media has said China's a boogeyman. And that's all affecting how people think about things. But I think that's why I would guess that that's why Biden is zeroing in here, because, hey, 81% of Americans don't like China. Do some things against China, and maybe your poll numbers will improve. And boy, does he need the poll numbers to improve, because he's ahead in Wisconsin, which is a swing state. But according to a New York Times Philadelphia Inquirer poll from April 28th to May 9th, he's behind in Pennsylvania, Arizona, Michigan, Georgia, and Nevada. And like, Biden's going to lose if he can't reverse those poll numbers in those key swing states. And it's not by small numbers either. It's 49-42 Arizona, 49-42 Michigan, 49-39 Georgia. As a native Georgian, I am shocked that Trump's interference or criticism of Georgia in the last election has not had a bigger impact on how Georgians are feeling. But my shock doesn't matter. Like, they're not riding with Biden, and maybe it's not riding with Biden. Maybe they should reach out to me. I wrote down, Rob, when you have your own podcast, it should be called In Short. I think that's a good title, right? Anyway, sorry, going off the rails here. All of which is to say, I get why Biden is throwing darts against the China dartboard. I don't think it's going to work. It's probably just going to make U.S.-China relations worse. I mean, whoever comes in is probably going to tighten the screws there. And I wonder where the opportunities there are in that basket, whether it's syringes and needles or ship-to-shore cranes or EV battery. Like, somewhere in there, there's opportunities and also probably a lot of disruption. So I'll leave it to you there. Anything you want to say about U.S.-China before we say goodbye to the listeners?
Yeah, there are a few things that I think are worth talking about briefly. The first is just, as always, how is the market reacting? And in this case, the market is not reacting, which I think is really worthwhile. It's the dog that didn't bark in this case. So my old friend Nucor Steel, who, as I've said, we have been short at off Wall Street and remain short, has not gotten up off the mat despite the announcement of these tariffs and the announcement of the steel tariffs, which I think is pretty telling, both in terms of what it means for how meaningful they are, but also because I think as we talked about a few weeks ago when we said had the discussion about what would happen if Trump really did what he says he's planning to do in terms of tariffs. Um, I think this is heading for a very bad scenario from a market standpoint. And I think you can see this is setting up where if you get even broader or bigger tariffs in the event of a Trump victory, um, I think that's just going to be very bad for growth and in a way that's unexpected for people who are looking back at the start of the trade war in 2017. Because, to rehash what I said before, at that time, our issue was lack of demand, right? We were exiting a deflationary period. Businesses weren't investing, they didn't see a reason. And, the response to the trade war was positive. All else equal, there were a lot of other things going on too. But that was not a harmful thing to do per se. The problem today is almost exactly the opposite. Businesses are investing like crazy, and the concerns of the market are not about lack of demand. The concern of the market is a supply concern. It's that, hey, inflation is worse than we thought. We could have consistent, supply tightness. We could have consistent inflation overshoots. Businesses don't need encouragement to invest, and that's what tariffs do. They literally take money out of the pockets of households and give it to business if they see the opportunity to invest. If they don't invest, it's just a net loss for everybody. And the economy doesn't do anything. It doesn't grow. The equilibrium turns lower, right? And I think that's probably what you're going to get, because businesses, they're not going to invest more than they are now, and they're going to look at what's happening with consumers and the hit to their pocketbook, which is already the biggest thing they're worried about, and they're going to freak out. And the fact that Nucor Steel is doing absolutely nothing when the market is rebounding to new highs this week, that is a bit of a canary in the coal mine to me. That shows me that something is not quite right with this idea that these tariffs are going to, accelerate US production and investment, and it's going to be so great. I think it's going to have very much the opposite effect, and that's going to be a big surprise for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, I was on mute, listeners. Maybe we'll just leave that in so you guys get to see how the sausage is made. No, I gave I gave a presentation a couple of weeks ago, and I put in a new slide, and it was about, because I wanted to talk about elections. It's very tough to talk about U.S. politics right now because we don't know who's going to win the election, and you have to give scenarios, and the scenarios are so different. But I gave sort of, okay, here's what happened if Biden wins, and here's what happens if Trump wins. And the way that I did that was I showed Biden's tax plans and all the money that it's going to take out of the economy and on businesses and things like that on the one hand, and then I put on Trump's tariffs plans. And the point that I made to the audience, which it resounded in a way I wasn't expecting, because I think of this, it's sort of like secondhand to me, but I think for most people it isn't. And this is in part because of the way that the media and the way politicians talk about this. Tariffs are taxes. They aren't some magical wand that you wave and somehow, as you say, U.S. manufacturing is going to increase. It's just moving the tax burden. So instead of the corporate tax burden is going to go here, or income tax on really rich people is going to increase, and all these knobs and levers that the Democrats, it's like, oh, the more pages in the document, the more levers that we pull, the more impressive we are, because we are the ones who managed to stay. Whereas Trump is just banging the tariff thing. But if you look at, okay, tariffs is going to lead to this much more money in U.S. coffers over this amount of time. Like, it's the same thing. It's about increasing government revenue, and it's about taking money away from the consumer, and the consumer is the one that's going to bear that as a tax. So if you're not thinking about it that way, Marco has actually talked about this a couple times, and I think he's right. There is no fiscally conservative candidate anywhere close to the ballot in this election, and probably won't be for some time. Like, these guys are they're changing exactly how they're going to get money out of the system, but it's extractive. It's not like anybody's thinking conservatively here. So that's first. The second thing is with the dog that bites. I think you're exactly right on steel, and I would bet, I haven't sort of dived deep enough yet on this, I would bet you're right about EVs and these critical mineral. Like, I think all of that is priced in. I do think, I mean, there were some dogs that did bark, though. That last sort of category, ship to shore cranes, syringes, needles, gloves, things like that. I didn't even know who made those things. Owens and Minor is apparently the name of the company that makes a lot of the surgical gloves, I believe, in the United States. They popped, and they're up 12% just over the last sort of 5-6 days, and their chart looks radically different than when and sort of started. Now maybe it'll sort of revert to the mean, like maybe it was just one of those, oh, it's in the news, and like it'll sort of go away. But for those, your Becton Dickens, like your sort of boring companies that have been making these things on the margins and have been getting killed because it's made cheaper in China, I wonder if there isn't something in there for them. Now, not to bring everything back to tires, but you probably know, Rob, like I date the beginning of the US China trade war to a conflict about tires between the US and China under the Obama administration. And in 2014, it was Obama who raised tariffs against Chinese tires. And then there was a retaliation on chicken. The result of that was not that the US tire industry entered a new renaissance, it was that Vietnam started making most of the tires. So like I'm not sure that like probably it's not going to be that these things like syringes and gloves are going to be made in the United States. It's probably going to be cheaper somewhere else. Maybe it's Mexico, maybe it's Indonesia. I don't know. It's probably not a 1-to-1 just buy the U.S. stock that makes these things. But I was surprised by the inclusion of that last basket of things. Like that wasn't priced into me. And I wonder if as we go forward, as we start throwing in more of these products, if there aren't going to be some opportunities around the fringes, whether it's U.S. companies or other companies that are going to be able to displace China, which has had that cost advantage for so long.
Yeah, and I think the Owens and Minor is a good example because gloves are, I mean, it's plastic, it's rubber gloves, right? I mean, it's
Yep.
masks and gloves, and it's very simple stuff. And when I say like, before, oh, the equilibrium, and if they don't invest, like that sounds very highfalutin, but this is a good tangible example. This is the government implementing a tariff that's taking money away from the consumers of gloves and giving it to Owens and Minor, among other, glove makers. If Owens and Minor, it depends on what, if you take $100 out of hospitals and consumers, and you give that to Owens and Minor, what are they going to do with it? Unless Owens and Minor is going to increase its capex budget by $100 because they're like, oh yeah, let's clean up on gloves, then the money is going to sit in their bank account and the economy is going to shrink by the equivalent amount. That's what I mean by the equilibrium turns negative if companies don't lack for opportunities to invest, right?
Yeah, exactly right. And this also, I mean, I didn't want to spend time on inflation because we've talked about it so much here and we did a little victory lap. Inflation this week, results were sort of middling. But you start to dig underneath the headline figures. It doesn't look like stagnation. There's still pockets that are where the economy is getting more expensive. And one is sort of hospital costs and costs for medical procedures. So there was a 7.7% increase in prices at hospitals over the last month. That's the highest in 13 years. And I mean, maybe it's just coincidence, but the timing of, these things are costing more and suddenly hospital prices are getting higher. Like you put all that together. So maybe here's one place where the American consumer is really going to feel it. And I sympathize with the US government here. Like we all remember COVID. We all remember when China was making all of the PPE and China was hoarding the PPE because it was nervous that it needed it all for itself. So there is a national security reason to have domestic production of some of these things. Emmanuel Macron's been talking about it. He's been using the term health sovereignty in France for a long time. But to your point, it's if all you think you have to do is like increase tariffs on syringes 25%, and boom, we're going to have syringes. Like that's not how it's going to work. And in the interim, an economy that's already running hot, maybe you're going to pay more at the hospital because needles are going to cost that much more. I don't know. It's a very slippery slope and a difficult thing to think about the second, third, fourth order consequences of when you put that tariff in place.
But just to add one tactical consideration, because I don't think you need to think to the third order even to really worry about the market impact here, which is like the CPI print this week basically showed a continuation of what's been going on, which is services CPI is slowly kind of coming off the boil as labor markets loosen up. Like this is not a surprise, right? The issue is goods CPI because everyone was freaking out last year and concerned about consumer demand falling off. Everyone ran down their inventories. The whole goods cycle went negative. So goods CPI was a huge drag on the overall number for all of 2023. And now in the last month or two, that's not a benefit anymore. Goods CPI is basically flat. And the last print, I didn't look to see what it was for this print. Now it's starting to go slightly positive. And if you hear what companies are saying, they're saying, "Oh, we're rebuilding inventories. Like, consumer isn't so bad." Um, if you get, and Home Depot reported this week, they had kind of muted results, but they said, hey, it looks like the cycle's turning for home investment, furniture, durables. All of this is lining up because everyone's saying, oh, inflation's coming off the boil. You have to look at the underlying components, because now the goods cycle is turning up again, and you're heading right into the election. If Trump introduces like broad blanket tariffs on every stupid widget and Christmas tree shop piece of shit that we import from China, pardon my language, but that's the reality. Right as the cycle in goods inflation is starting to move up, you're going to have a massive impact, because it's like waiting for that curveball to curve right into the strike zone and whaling it. Like, it's gonna be a huge surprise, and people are gonna freak out. And increasingly, that looks like the way things are lining up.
Well, and it's also looking like that might happen under Biden anyway. Like, you might not need the Trump scenario to do it, because like Biden is telegraphing, like, ship to short grains, syringes and needles. Like, what's next on the list? To your point about the Christmas tree shops. That's 70 minutes. I think we should probably say goodbye there. There's other stuff going on in the world. The prime minister of Slovakia was shot by an assassin. It looks like it was a lone wolf who was kind of crazy, so I didn't lead off with it, but that happened, and it's something to watch. Jordan said it foiled a plot, an Iranian plot to get weapons into the kingdom. That was sort of a big deal. You sort of look around the world, there was a lot of stuff going on, so I didn't want to smush it all in here. But unlike in the last couple of weeks where I feel like I've been straining to put, and I didn't even mention, Russia replacing its defense minister and putting an economist in charge of the defense ministry. You can probably tease out the implications of that yourself, but maybe we'll lead there next week. So this was just a smattering of what's going on in the world, but it's been a very, very busy one. Sign up for the sit rep if you're not, or make sure that you're staying on top of things, because the last few weeks were pleasant, but when it rains, it pours. So, Rob, we have work to do. So let's say goodbye to the listeners, and we'll see them next week. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.